the idea is, and Starmer seems to genuinely believe this, that it is not the NHS needs to be reformed, it's the general public. And that is the only way to save the NHS. I don't want somebody saying, I hate the nanny state, but I don't want someone saying, I love the nanny state and. I want somebody to say, I hate the nanny state and. We are an outlier. We are not. It's not that you mentioned the zeitgeist. We're actually beyond the zeitgeist. We are out on a limb with these things. I don't think people realise quite what an outlier we are. Just to give you three particularly important examples. One is the ban on so-called junk food advertising online and before 9 p.m. on television. The government has recently confirmed this is going to take place in October next year. No other country is doing anything like it. Anything like it. The BBC wrote an article about this saying which other countries have already done this, assuming some other countries have already done it. They haven't. Norway is thinking about restricting this kind of advertising during children's TV programmes, which is in fact what we did under Blair in 2007. Portugal is thinking about doing the same thing. Nobody else is even considering anywhere near such an extensive ban on such an extensive list of foods, which people to this day I don't think actually realise how extensive the category of so-called junk food is. The second one is, of course, the generational tobacco ban, which no other country in the world is doing. It was famously nicked from the New Zealand Labour Party of Jacinda Ardern. She then got booted out of office. They got an actually Conservative government in. They said, this is not the kind of thing the Conservative government should be doing. And nobody else is seriously looking at this idea, which has cross-party support. It's almost impossible to find a party to vote for if you're against this particular policy. Maybe reform, because Farage smoked, but everybody else seems to be completely up with this. Literally a year ago, you couldn't find a single party. If you wanted to prohibit tobacco, there wasn't a party to vote for. Now there isn't a party that seems to be against it. And I say, no other country has done it. The last country, such as it is, to have banned tobacco is the Islamic State. The one before that was Bhutan, and they got rid of the ban in 2021 because there were so many smugglers coming over the border, they were worried about spreading COVID. These are not sensible policies, but they are also not mainstream policies. Another one in the area of gambling, which is dishonestly portrayed as a public health issue, affordability checks. What a lovely idea. We'll just check if people can afford to spend the amount of money they're spending on gambling. It's completely impractical. It's yet another of these 3 a.m. kind of ideas that the various governments have come up with. There's no way of doing it. Goodness knows how the Gambling Commission is going to attempt to do it. But more to the point, nobody else is doing it. We are an outlier. We are not. It's not that you mentioned the zeitgeist. We're actually beyond the zeitgeist. We are out on a limb with these things. And all these policies were Tory policies. And all the Labour Party have had to do is just take them off the shelf, put some bells and whistles on them, tighten them up even more. But they were, to quote a phrase, oven ready when the Labour Party came in. I would just like to finish by saying something about why you should oppose these things, really. There are lots of reasons, both in terms of principle and pragmatism. But there's a particular sinister rationale, which Keir Starmer and Wes Streeting made quite explicit, and Sunak kind of alluded to at the conference last year, and David's kind of alluded to it already, with the idea that we are there to protect the NHS. This obviously was a big motif during the pandemic, which at least was an infectious disease, unlike these other things, which are really nobody else's business. But the idea is, and Starmer seems to genuinely believe this, that it is not the NHS needs to be reformed, it's the general public. And that is the only way to save the NHS. This, as it happens, is economically nonsense. I won't go into the details, but it just simply is not true that by addressing these so-called lifestyle-related diseases, you save money in the long term, you actually increase spending in the long term. But even if it were true, I think it would be an extremely dangerous idea to put into the mainstream. You don't need a lot of imagination to see the number of things, the amount of regimentation of life that would come about if the main responsibility of us as individuals was to make the NHS as efficient as possible. So for that reason alone, I think we should be opposing it, but we should be opposing it on principle. And I don't want somebody saying, I hate the nanny state, but I don't want someone saying, I love the nanny state and. I want somebody to say, I hate the nanny state and. Let's be consistent in what we're actually saying. And now that the Conservative Party is opposition, presumably it will start opposing lots of this stuff. And that will take a bit of a U-turn, given that they've introduced or tried to introduce so much of this stuff. But presumably the Conservative Party is going to have to U-turn on things like national service and say, we're under new management now. Things are going to be a bit different. And I hope that personal liberty will be a big part of the party under whatever management it has.
My first question to the panel is, how do you then convince everybody outside of this room that that is the way forward, not just from a consequentialist perspective, the tobacco ban is bad because we'll see loads and loads of illegal products being produced, but actually the tobacco ban is bad because it is immoral for the government to tell adults what they can and cannot do with their own bodies. How do we convince them?
I don't see much of a clash between the two things you mentioned. I mean, freedom is, I take freedom as a first principle because I think freedom actually produces the best outcomes. Now, Charlie would probably call me a utilitarian for that, and would probably find things we could disagree on. But generally speaking, I think it is true to say that free markets produce the best outcomes and individual freedom produces the best outcomes, with the caveat that there can be negative externalities you need to deal with, and you can have sensible regulation, and you want to keep the kind of products I'm talking about out of the hands of children. But it is, history shows that prohibition doesn't just not work in the sense of actually prohibiting, but also causes all sorts of other problems. Australia at the moment is up to about 110 in a number of firebombings of tobacconists. Hasn't really made the papers over here, which is kind of surprising because it's quite an extraordinary story. But they haven't got prohibition of tobacco. They have prohibition of e-cigarettes, which hasn't helped, and they have the highest cigarette taxes in the world. And now organised criminals are essentially telling corner shops and tobacconists, either you sell our counterfeit product or we're going to firebomb you. And they say they've had over 100 firebombings. That is a consequence of neo-prohibitionism, not even full prohibition. So you have all sorts of negative consequences. But the main negative consequence of kind of coercive paternalistic action is very difficult to quantify. But it is basically that people cannot lead the lives that they want to lead. They cannot access necessarily their first preference and have to settle at best for their second preference. And you are causing actual harm to people if you're stopping people doing what they like. Now, many of you here may not eat so-called junk food, and most of you probably don't smoke, and some of you won't drink. But I would ask you to think of the things that you do enjoy doing, whatever they may be, and consider what would happen if the government decided to charge an 800% tax on them, as we do with whiskey and cigarettes, or indeed ban them outright. So you might think subjectively that these things are not good, and in many cases objectively they are not good for your health, but health is not the only thing that matters, and that's what we seem to have lost track of in this discussion. The only people who seem to have any say in the matter are rather fanatical far left groups like the British Medical Association, and these tiny, often state-funded pressure groups who you could fit into a mini metro. And so the whole debate has become unbalanced by this obsessive focus on health, which is a very important part of well-being, but it is not the only part of well-being. And joy and pleasure and leading the life that you want to lead are at least equally important, and they seem to be being tossed to the side for reasons I genuinely cannot understand, because it seems to me that a lot of the people who say I hate the nanny state but, and I believe in free markets but, probably really do at least think that they believe in these things. And yet for 14 years we've had one thing after another, and I suspect that a lot of Conservative ministers in particular probably look back on the last 14 years, think about the reasons they became a Conservative in the first place, which involves quite a lot of hatred being thrown at you. You know, you would think you have to be fairly committed to something if you're going to go through the horrible process of becoming a candidate, standing for election and kissing babies and knocking on doors and all the rest of it, and yet spend your political career doing the exact opposite of all the things you supposedly believe in. It's very puzzling and probably very disappointing for those people. Let's not do it again if we get the chance.